For my next two video lectures, we're going to cover national security and the threat of climate change. Of all of the material that's covered in this course, this is what I consider to be the most important body of information that we need to know. So, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change is a report that was put together by the Center for Naval Research. The entire report is a PDF file in the Unit 2 materials. So just so we understand who the authors of this report are. The authors are leading retired U.S. Army generals, U.S. Navy admirals, vice admirals, members of the U.S. Air Force, and members of the U.S. Marine Corps retired. So scientists were also involved in the documentation of this report, but understand that global climate change is a threat to national security is a report that has been documented by leading military personnel in our country. So in this document, our military leaders define climate change a little bit differently. They say that climate change is the influence of climate change on geostrategic balances and world events that could likely involve U.S. military forces or otherwise affect U.S. strategic interest anywhere in the world. This can happen in a number of different ways. One of the ones that we've seen frequently in the last 20 years or more is via delivery of humanitarian aid. The U.S. military is the biggest military on the planet. It has resources that other countries don't have. And because of that, when a humanitarian disaster happens globally, like for example, the earthquake that struck Haiti about a decade ago, there is no other entity on the planet that can more rapidly mobilize and move people, medical supplies, food, and other resources to an area that has been struck by a disaster. So the U.S. military has been involved globally and in the United States in delivering humanitarian aid whenever crises happen. The United States military has also participated in UN and other peacekeeping missions around the world, most prevalently in recent years in some North African countries. The military can be involved in protection of resources. So for example, the United States and Canada are sitting on top of the biggest freshwater supply on the planet in terms of the Great Lakes. The United States military, in conjunction with the Canadian military, has a plan of action in place to protect that water source for our two countries if needed. The military has been involved in border control, and also in direct military intervention. So for example, U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 or 2002, following 9/11, U.S. military participating in the fight against the ISIL and other terrorist groups in Iraq and across Syria. So climate change, the military believes, is going to increase the number of opportunities that the military has to provide humanitarian aid and to be part of military intervention, if not full-out conflict, in the near future. Okay. So a couple of things that we're going to talk about today. The geostrategic implications of climate change. We're going to talk a little bit about specific regional security issues, namely across northern and sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, the Americas, and a little bit on Europe. We're also going to talk about direct effects of climate change on military systems and military operation. And at the end of this report, the Center for Naval Research makes some recommendations. Okay. So, the first off observation, what we already know about climate change. In the 20th century, the average global temperature has risen. It's continuing to rise as we have moved 21 years now into the 21st century. As we saw in our previous discussion on climate change, this will affect habitats for humans and animals. This has impacted precipitation events, leading to flooding in some areas and severe drought in others. We're seeing more extreme weather events, things like tornadoes and hurricanes. Ice cover in the polar ice cap, but also globally, glaciers are melting, and we're seeing sea level rise. Okay. Now, I put this out here because this is in the report, but we can read through it and laugh a little bit about it. It says that the goal of the military after World War II was maintaining stability and avoiding full-scale military conflict. If you know anything whatsoever about U.S. history after World War II, you're laughing because you know that at the end of World War II, we segued fairly quickly into conflict in the Korean Peninsula in the 1950s. That did not end well. We then moved over into the Vietnam War during the 1960s into the early 1970s. We have been involved militarily in conflict and wars across the Middle East on a number of occasions. So avoiding full-scale military conflict, we can all agree the United States has failed at. There was also a stated goal of instilling security where it does not exist. Again, we have failed at this. Case in point, when the United States invaded the country of Iraq after 9/11 and removed Saddam Hussein from power, what they left was a power vacuum. That power vacuum was filled by different organizations seeking power, and this included the terrorist groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda that moved into the region. So one can argue or not argue whether or not Iraq was a good country with Saddam Hussein in power, but what we did know was that it was a secure country, and now it's not. That said, the challenges for continuing to attempt to maintain stability and avoiding military conflict, the challenge of this is that climate change is going to deteriorate environmental conditions globally. In many places, resources are not going to be available. Water resources, food resources that societies need to survive. When societies become stressed because basic needs cannot be met, some of them are going to collapse. And when they collapse, that's when terrorist groups move in, and that's also where you get mass migrations of people fleeing a situation. Okay. So, when you go to do your third assignment for this class, come back to this particular PowerPoint and look at the geostrategic implications of climate change. Some of the things that are going to destabilize countries that are already poor, already struggling to meet basic needs of people in terms of adequate food, shelter, and potable drinking water. Climate change is going to make these situations worse. So we've already seen droughts across regions of the world, across the northern African countries, so Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, across countries in the Middle East. Syria experienced a severe drought, and that's part of what led to the current unstable situation and the recent civil war that was fought in that country. Farmers could no longer farm because of the severe drought. They moved to the cities to look for work. cities were not prepared infrastructure-wise to handle that influx of people coming in, and an already unstable situation in that country was made worse. Okay? Drought is going to cause impaired food production. Even increased temperatures cause impaired food production. So when countries cannot produce enough food to feed themselves, and when other countries don't have as much food to export, then you're going to have global hunger increasing. There's going to be more health catastrophes. We've seen recently, obviously the last year and a half, we're all experiencing COVID. But before that, we had the issue of the Zika virus, when we had the issue of Ebola across parts of Western Africa. We're going to see more land loss and flooding globally, including loss of coastal lands, which is going to displace a lot of people and result in loss of also croplands and impaired food production. All of this is going to mean greater potential for failed states, and by states we mean countries. A failed state is one in which the government is unable to meet the fundamental needs of people for water, food, shelter, medical care, and safety. When you have a failed state, people can't survive there anymore, so you see mass migrations of people. And of course, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there have been mass migrations of people fleeing the violence in Syria, which is essentially a failed state, trying to get into Europe. People from Northern Africa fleeing conflict, drought, impaired food production, also fleeing, trying to get into Europe. We've seen problems that arise when we had these mass migrations of people. We can also see escalation of conflicts over resources. A good example of this is that the country of Ethiopia wants to build a dam on the Nile River, and that would create a reservoir that would create more water resources for Ethiopia. But at least for a long number of years while the dam reservoir was filling, Egypt would see reduced water resources. Egypt relies on the Nile River for its very survival. So the country of Egypt has stated that should the Ethiopian dam project go to fruition, Egypt will go to war with them to stop that. Okay. So let's break these down and talk about each one a bit more. Right now, 40% of the world's population gets its drinking water from summer glacier melt. So glaciers in the Andes Mountains in South America, glaciers in the Himalayan Plateau in China, glaciers in Colorado that feed the Colorado River that then flows to Lake Mead and then south through parts of Arizona and California, providing water supplies for people. But globally, because of climate change, mountain glaciers are threatened. The other thing we're seeing from this is more rain and less snow. The problem with that is that the rain runs off very quickly. The snow melts more slowly, so it provides a river with a more sustainable water flow. So places where, especially in the Himalayan Plateau and emanating from the rivers that come down from that, are experiencing more floods during the rainy season. The countries of Pakistan and India have seen extreme flooding situations over the last decade. But then there's less water during the dry season, which is often the agricultural season. Okay. So a good case study of this, as I said, is the Himalayan issue. So many major Asian rivers start in the Himalayas from glacier melt there. The Indus and the Ganges that flow into India, and the Indus at least eventually winds up in Pakistan. The Mekong that feeds the Mekong Delta Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia, and the Yangtze and the Yellow rivers that flow down into China. So these major rivers provide water for India, Pakistan, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Noting, of course, that the two most populous nations in the world are India and China. Also noting that rivers that flow, like the Indus River, through India and into Pakistan, when the Indus River begins to dry up before it reaches Pakistan, that's going to cause conflict between India and Pakistan. And it's already a well-known and well-established fact that India and Pakistan are already nations at conflict with each other. So losing the water resources and having reduced water flow in these major rivers is going to result in loss of crop production in these countries, conflict over water sources, which means less potable drinking water, less irrigation water, and reduced food supplies. Okay. The current global situation, most countries in the Middle East and North Africa are already water scarce. By 2025, 40% of the world's population, so 4 years from now, will live in areas experiencing water shortages. Again, this includes Pakistan, India, parts of it, parts of China, and South Africa. Even across the desert southwest of the United States, there's an extreme heat wave going on right now in the summer of 2021, and extreme drought conditions have been there for about the last decade, getting worse every year. So water scarcity is becoming a problem across the southwestern United States also. Okay. So part of the problem with water scarcity is impaired food production. But even if you have adequate water, ecologists say that for every 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature rise, grain production decreases by 10%. So if you look at the grain belt in the United States, from Texas up through Oklahoma, Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, as the temperatures are getting hotter, the grain yields are decreasing. This isn't really going to be a problem for the United States because the United States is a huge global exporter of food. We will always have enough food in the United States for ourselves. Distribution of it and impacts of poverty are a different issue that create the situation of why not everyone has enough food. But the United States can grow enough food to feed itself. What we may not be able to do is grow enough food to export on the level that we currently are. So those countries that will lose our exports will experience hunger. Again, we've seen globally that shifting precipitation patterns means shifting agricultural lands. Drought across Texas, across Nebraska, across Oklahoma and Kansas are shifting agricultural lands northward. And all of this is compounded by a growing world population that's projected to reach 9 billion people by 2050. So we have a problem where our crop productivity is going down, our water supplies are going down, but our population is going up. Okay. So current situation, there are already food shortages in the Indian subcontinent and in sub-Saharan Africa. Countries like Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia have food shortages. Often the countries that have the highest food shortages or food insecurity have high population growth rates. And these areas are expected to become hotter and drier. So the situation is just going to be exacerbated more and more in the future. So European countries can expect more migrations of people from northern and sub-Saharan Africa, and the United States can expect additional migration from people in Mexico, Central, and South America as environmental conditions get worse. A really good case study of this is the Darfur region of Sudan. Sudan is a very unique country, and there is northern Sudan that is more impacted by the Arabic world, so the people are more ethnically Arabic and Muslim. More southern Sudan was more impacted by Africa and by colonialism. So the people there tend to be more African, but they tend to practice Christianity because of colonialism. So you already have a country that's split by cultural and religious differences. Now imagine they've had extreme drought, which has reduced crop and grazing lands. So the nomads have to migrate because they need more and more land to feed their animals as the drought has reduced the grazing lands. If you combine that with population growth, tribal and ethnic and religious differences, what Sudan saw about a decade ago was violent conflict, ethnic genocide of people in the Darfur region, and a destabilized government. Okay. So all of this can ultimately lead to a threat of terrorism. So food and water shortages create instability, especially in poor countries that already struggle to meet the basic needs of people. Where there's instability and governments cannot maintain adequate security and control, terrorist groups come in and they establish cells. Often they attack the country that they're in, but we know from September 9/11 and other global terrorist attacks that terrorists globally can plan attacks on any other country on the planet. So some of the things that we've seen as a result, the Arab Spring happened about 10 or 15 years ago because of rising food prices and food shortages. Because of drought, because of flooding, there were crop losses in Russia and China. When anything happens in the United States or Russia or China, be it a severe drought, be it flooding, be it increased temperatures, that reduces crop productivity, even by as much as 5 or 10%, global food prices go up because the US, Russia, and China are the three biggest global exporters of food. Now, when food prices go up, middle-class Americans go to the grocery store and we say, wow, food costs a lot more than it used to, and then we buy it because we can. I say that at the same time understanding that a significant number of Americans are food insecure, and I do not want to diminish their experience by making it sound like all Americans can afford to pay higher food prices. But in these other countries, they don't have local food banks or anything to help people with hunger. So when food prices rise, people across these unstable areas go hungry. Much of the world's population lives on fewer than $2 a day, and you cannot adequately feed yourself or a family when food prices go up. So as instability has come in because of these global climate change related issues, terrorist cells, Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, Sudan, Somalia, and Bahrain, but Boko Haram in Nigeria, ISIS or ISIL in Syria and Iraq have erupted globally. And they move into these areas and they employ the people. They give them a means of providing food for their family. So these terrorist cells grow and they can begin to plot attacks against either elements in their own countries or against the Western world, as we have seen in the last 2 decades. Okay. some of the other problems that are exacerbated that cause security issues or health catastrophes. So the malaria mosquito now exists at higher altitudes and farther north and south of the equator than ever before. So these vector-borne diseases are spreading globally. Again, we saw the Zika virus migrate from Brazil all the way up to the southeastern United States. We're going to see more foodborne diseases. And of course, decline of fresh water supplies also impacts disease. So there's going to be a lot more regional health emergencies with things like Ebola, with things like Zika globally. And as I said at the beginning, when there is a global emergency, there is no entity that can react more rapidly with aid and help than the U.S. military. So this is going to create opportunities for the U.S. military to provide humanitarian aid. Okay. Globally, we've already started to see a lot of land loss and flooding. The majority of the world's population lives close to a coastline. This is also where industrial and port facilities are for ease of shipping from one country to another. A lot of energy production happens on coastlines because of the need of cooling water. Military installations, think of all of the U.S. military bases along the East Coast in Pensacola, Florida, and other coastal areas. All of these are now made vulnerable by rising sea levels, and as we saw with, say, Superstorm Sandy, the storm surges are now higher. And because of that, we're seeing land loss from erosion. Okay. To a great degree, the U.S. military is having to consider either building up bombardment systems, seawalls, to protect their coastal military bases from storm surges, or potentially moving the military bases further inland. Okay. So, some of the current situation with land loss and flooding. Some of the most important major rivers and deltas in the world are very densely populated. The Niger River in Nigeria, the Yangtze in China, the Mississippi River, where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico around New Orleans, Louisiana, the Nile in Egypt, the Ganges in India, the Mekong in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, and the Rhine River in Germany. So rising sea levels and storm surges are bringing saline water to fresh water supplies. If I can give you any useful advice in this class, do not move to southern Florida, because rising sea levels there are going to eventually cause salt water to intrude into the freshwater aquifers under the landmass of Florida, rendering a lot of potable drinking water supplies useless. And of course, in many areas, coastal croplands are being destroyed. We've already seen in some places globally where this could cause a mass migration of people, and it's anticipated that that situation is going to get worse. So I'm going to leave off for now, and I'm going to continue talking about the specific security threats associated with these geostrategic implications of climate change. So I'll see you back in just a little bit.